I had been bleeding for 2 hours before I admitted it was serious. The cut ran from just below my left shoulder to the edge of my ribs, a border raider's blade, angled poorly, which was the only reason I was still in the saddle. My second Tauren had wanted to ride for Ravenmark at full speed, find a healer there, have the wound dressed in proper rooms with proper instruments by a man who knew exactly who he was touching. I had told him no. Ravenmark was 4 hours north, the hold of Drevorn was 40 minutes east, and I was losing blood in a way that made the moors tilt at the edges of my vision. The decision was not difficult. It was simply not the decision Tauren would have chosen for me. He never did learn to choose the practical thing over the dignified one. Drevorn was a small hold, a border garrison technically, though it functioned more as a supply stop and a rest point for the southern patrol routes. It sat low against the hills, stone buildings the color of old cloud, everything built to resist wind rather than impress a visitor. There was a training yard in the center, a long hall, a stable, and a series of lower rooms carved into the hillside that I had never had cause to enter. The hold's ranking wolf was a man named Breck, broad and loud, who had served under my father's council before the old guard turned over. He was competent. He was also, in my experience, the kind of man who performed competence more than he exercised it, useful in a hall full of observers, less useful on a dark moor where no one was watching. I did not announce myself. This was not vanity, or not only vanity. I had learned over 12 years of ruling Ravenmark that announced arrivals produced a particular kind of truth, the truth men wanted their king to see. I preferred the other kind. So Tauren and I rode into Drevorn's courtyard in plain cloaks, gave our names as patrol riders from the eastern ridge, and asked if the hold had a healer. The ranked wolf at the gate, a young man, eager, a silver pin on his collar he had not yet earned the steadiness to carry, looked us over, saw 2 travel-worn riders, and almost turned us away. I watched him decide we were not worth the hold's full hospitality. Then he saw Tauren's hand pressed against my side and the color of what was seeping through my cloak, and he changed his mind. "Herbkeeper's below," he said, already moving back to his post. "Down the east steps, second door, she'll be in." "Not he, she." I filed that away and descended. The herb room was exactly what the name suggested, a room full of herbs, hung and dried and sorted into clay pots along every shelf, labeled in a hand so small and precise it looked like the writing of someone who did not trust that other people would read carefully. The room smelled of dried yarrow and something resinous I could not name, and there was a brazier in the corner putting out steady heat without smoke. A work table ran the length of the inner wall, covered in tools I recognized only approximately. Small blades, cloth strips, glass bottles with stoppered necks, a mortar that had been used recently enough that the stone was still faintly stained. The woman at the table had her back to me. She was sorting something by color, small dried leaves, and she did not turn when the door opened. "Set whatever it is on the stool," she said. "I'll be there in a moment." I was, in the ordinary course of things, not spoken to this way. This is not a complaint, simply an observation. When I entered a room, people turned. They had been turning for me since I was 19 years old and took the Ravenmark seat from my father's cold hands and showed the assembled pack that I was not going to be managed. 12 years of that had produced a particular reflex in the people around me. They oriented toward me the way a compass orients north, not always by choice, simply by the pull of the thing. This woman was still sorting her leaves. I set nothing on the stool because I had nothing to set. Tauren, behind me, made a small sound that I recognized as him suppressing amusement. I gave him a look over my shoulder that suppressed it further. "I don't have anything to set," I said. "It's the man who needs setting." She turned then, not quickly, not startled, just the natural pace of someone who had finished the task in hand before attending to the next one. She was perhaps 30, perhaps a little less. Dark hair pulled back without ceremony. Eyes the color of storm-gray moorland, not a compliment I would have reached for on another occasion, but standing in a herb room in a hold carved into a hillside, it was simply accurate. She looked at me the way she had looked at her leaves, taking in information, deciding what it meant. "Shoulder," she said. It was not a question. "Left side, below the shoulder above the hip." "Sit." I sat on the stool. She pulled a second stool from under the table, set it in front of mine, and lifted the edge of my cloak without asking. I would have noted the presumption, except that I had not come here to be handled with gloves on. I had come here to stop bleeding, and she clearly understood that. "How long ago?" 2 hours, roughly. Blade or something else. Blade short-angled, not deep. She was already cleaning around the cut, warm water, not cold, which was correct. I knew enough field medicine to know that much, with a cloth that had been folded into a precise square. The precision of the cloth told me something. Everything in this room was orderly, not arranged for show, arranged for speed. This was the workspace of someone who had used it under pressure, who knew where everything was because she had needed to reach for it in the dark. "The gate wolf should have sent someone down to tell me you were coming," she said, not looking up. "So I'd have the compresses ready." He was occupied. He was leaning on his spear and deciding whether you were interesting enough to trouble over. She said it without rancor, simply as fact. "You were bleeding through your cloak and he still almost sent you back to the yard. He does that." She pressed the cloth against the cut firmly, held it. "Hold that." I held it. Torin, behind me, had found the wall to lean against, and was doing so with the look of a man who had decided to enjoy himself. "It will need closing," she said. 3 points, probably 4. She was already at the shelf, pulling down a bottle, pouring something into a shallow dish. "This will sting." "I expect it will." Most people say they don't mind, and then mind considerably. "I'll try not to embarrass myself." Something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile, but a neighboring thing. She brought the dish back and applied the solution to the cut without further warning, which was the correct approach. I breathed through it. She watched my face with the same assessing look she had given everything else, checking for the information she needed, not performing concern. "You hold still well," she said. "I've had practice. Patrol rider. Something like that." She threaded the needle with the same unhurried certainty she applied to everything, and she closed the wound in 4 clean points, exactly as she had said. I had been closed by the healer at Ravenmark, a skilled man, careful and deferential, and this was the same quality of work. Better, perhaps, in the steadiness of the hand. "You'll want to keep it dry for 3 days, she said, knotting the last stitch. "And don't use the left arm overhead. I'll make a compress with dried moss and briarwort. It pulls infection. Leave it on overnight." "Thank you." She looked up then, and for a moment she studied me with frank attention in a way that no one in Ravenmark would have dared, not because I had forbidden it, but because 12 years of authority had made people careful about looking directly at me for too long. She was not careful. She was curious, and she saw no reason to disguise it. "You're not a patrol rider," she said. It was not a challenge. It was just a woman who read things accurately, arriving at an accurate reading. "What makes you say that?" "Your hands." She began cleaning the tools on her work table with the same methodical attention she gave everything. "Patrol riders have hands that are rough all the way across, rope work, saddle work, fighting. Yours are rough at the grip points and nowhere else. That's a man who trains deliberately, not a man who works." She did not look up. "You're some kind of officer, high enough that people do the rough work for you, not so high that you've stopped training entirely." From behind me, Torin said nothing. He was working very hard at nothing. "Something like that," I said again. She made a sound that meant she had accepted the non-answer and was not particularly interested in pressing it. "The compress will be ready in a half-hour. You can wait there or come back." I waited there. I should have ridden for Ravenmark the next morning. The wound was closed, the bleeding had stopped. Torin had found us sleeping quarters in the hold's upper hall, good enough rooms, plain enough that no one paid us particular attention. The practical thing was to rest one night, take the compress off in the morning, confirm the closure was holding, and ride north. I had counsel at Ravenmark in 3 days. I had correspondence that Torin kept describing as mounting. I had, in the ordinary structure of my life, no reason to linger in a small border hold that smelled of yarrow and old stone. I went back to the herb room the next morning. I told myself it was to have the wound checked. This was not entirely untrue. It was reasonable to have the closure examined before a 4-hour ride. What was less reasonable was the speed with which I came down the east steps, or the fact that I had been aware of where the east steps were from the moment I woke up, the way a man is aware of a fire in a cold room without having to search for it. She was already at work when I arrived. She had a different task today. She was pressing something in the mortar, slow and patient, and the room smelled of something green and sharp that I did not recognize. "Wound check," she said without turning. "Among other things." She turned at that, giving me a brief, assessing look. What other things? I did not have an answer I was willing to give, so I said, "What is that you're grinding?" This was, apparently, an acceptable redirection, she told me. It was a plant I had not encountered, grew only at a certain elevation on the southern hills, had to be harvested before the frost took it, was useful for exactly 3 things, and one of those 3 things she was not certain about because the older texts disagreed with each other, and she had not yet had enough cases to confirm it herself. She told me this the way she told me everything, without decoration, without performing the telling for my benefit, simply putting the information in the air because I had asked, and she saw no reason to withhold it. I pulled the second stool from under the table and sat down. She examined the wound without comment, pressed around the closed points, checked the skin for heat, confirmed the compress had done its work. "No infection," she said. "The closure is holding. You could ride tomorrow if you're careful." "I'll give it another day." She looked at me again with that frank curiosity. "Is there something keeping you in Drevorn?" "The wound." "I just said the wound is holding." "I said I'd give it another day." A pause, then she went back to her mortar. "Suit yourself. You can sit there if you want. Don't touch anything without asking." I sat there for 2 hours. I did not touch anything without asking. She worked and talked when I asked questions and did not talk when I did not, and at some point I realized that this, a room, a task, a person who did not require anything from me, was a thing I had not had in a very long time. My days in Ravenmark were full of people who required things from me. Not always badly. Some of them required important things, things I was genuinely glad to provide. But the requirement was constant. There was always someone in the doorway, always a decision, always the particular weight of being the weight-bearing wall that everything else leaned against. I had not noticed how much I carried it until I sat in a low-ceilinged herb room in a border hold and felt it put down. My wolf, which had been quiet for so long that I sometimes forgot it was there, not absent, simply resting, conserved, held in, shifted against the inside of my ribs. Not agitated, not restless, the opposite of restless. It was the stillness of a creature that had walked a long way and found the place it had been walking toward. I did not understand this yet, but I noticed it. On the second day, I learned that she had been at Drevorn for 6 years. She had come from the Central Territories, from a larger hold, one of the ranked packs in the middle of the southern reaches, where she had trained under an older herb keeper for 4 years before the older woman died, and the new ranked wolf of that hold had decided the position should go to someone with a family name. She had no family name worth citing. She had her training, her tools, and the knowledge that Drevorn needed a herb keeper and would take one without asking too many questions about lineage. She said this without self-pity, which was the only way she seemed to say anything. Not bitterness, not resignation, simply the report of what had happened, stripped of the embroidery that other people would have wrapped around it to make themselves seem more aggrieved or more stoic. It had happened. She had come here. Here was where she was. "Did you want to go back?" I asked. "To the Central Territories. To a larger hold, more resources, more—" I looked around the herb room at the shelves and the clay pots and the brazier. "More of what you use." "I have what I use," she said. "I know what Drevorn needs and I know what grows on this hill. If I were in a larger hold, I'd be working in a larger room with more bottles, and I'd still be working with what grew on that particular hill." She paused, turning one of the clay pots in her hands, checking the label. "The work doesn't get bigger because the room does." I thought about this for most of the afternoon. In the evening I went up to the hold's long hall for the meal, which was the first time I had eaten with Drevorn's pack in any formal way. Breck, the ranking wolf, had identified Torin and me as senior riders by then, not by name, but by manner, and had seated us near enough to the head of the table to be flattering without being presumptuous. He talked a great deal. He had opinions about the border situation that were not inaccurate, but also not original, and he delivered them with the confidence of a man who had not yet encountered someone whose opinion was better informed than his own. I answered when asked. I watched the hall. Sable was not there. I asked Torin quietly, and he said, with the face of a man who had decided he was going to say nothing about any of this, and was therefore only answering direct questions, that the herb keeper typically ate in the lower rooms or didn't come up at all. "The ranked wolves don't go out of their way to include her," he said, "from what I can tell." I looked at the long table, full of men eating well, and thought about the woman in the room below who had closed my wound in 4 clean points, and told me the older texts about Briarwort disagreed with each other. "She's been here 6 years," I said. "Yes, and they don't seat her at the table." Torin said nothing. He did not need to. On the 3rd morning, I told Torin I would be another day, possibly 2. He absorbed this with the expression of a man who has known a person for 15 years, and has therefore stopped being surprised by them while not entirely stopping being concerned. "The wound," I said. "Of course," he said. I went down the east steps. She was at the table sorting roots, flat, pale ones, laid out in rows that she was inspecting one by one. I had learned by now not to announce myself or wait to be acknowledged. I pulled the second stool out, sat down, and looked at what she was doing. "Fever root," she said. "Some of it goes soft at the core over winter. I have to check the whole store." "How do you tell?" She held one up, pressed it lightly in the center. "Feel. If it gives the way a bruised apple does, it's no good." She handed it to me. I pressed it. It was firm. "That one's fine." And then, without discussion, without agreement, I began sorting roots. She checked them, and I moved them to the good pile or the discard pile as she indicated, and we worked through the whole box, and this took the better part of an hour, and neither of us said much. When the box was done, she said, "You're still here." "I'm still here." "The wound is closed." "It is." She looked at me squarely. There was no aggression in it and no coyness, just the same honest attention she gave everything. "Then what are you looking for?" I had been asking myself this question for 3 days, and I had not been ready to answer it. Now, sitting in the low herb room with the sordid roots between us and the brazier putting out its quiet heat, I found that I was ready, not because I had arrived at certainty, but because I was done pretending the question was difficult. "I'm not sure," I said, "but I think I found some of it." She held my gaze for a moment. Then she said, "There's more fever root in the back if you want to keep sorting." I kept sorting. It was on the 4th morning that I felt the mark. I had not been expecting it, which is perhaps a foolish thing to admit, given what I had been feeling for 3 days, but there is a difference between the slow accumulation of a recognition and the thing itself. The thing itself arrived without warning. She had come to check the wound one final time. She said she wanted to confirm the closure before I rode, because 4 hours on horseback was not the same as 2 hours on a stool, and she wanted the point she had been uncertain about, the second one, which had been the smallest and the most awkward to place, to be solid before I went. She stood beside me and pressed gently around the closure, her fingers calm and sure, and when she pressed at the second point she must have felt something, a tightness perhaps, because she said, "Hold a moment," and reached for the cloth on the table. She pressed it against my shoulder, the cold cloth, exactly as she had done on the first night, and the mark burned. It was not pain. I want to be precise about that because it is a word that gets applied to this moment and it is not accurate. It was heat, a deep heat, starting in the palm of her hand and running up into my shoulder and across my chest and down into my sternum, the way a struck bell sends its vibration through everything it is connected to. I heard a sound I could not source. My wolf rose, not with aggression, not with urgency, simply with the absolute, unwavering certainty of a creature arriving at the thing it has been moving toward for its entire life, and pressed against the inside of my ribs so hard I had to breathe carefully. She had gone still. She was looking at her hand, at the mark that had appeared there on the inside of her wrist, the raven mark wolf's head rendered in deep gold against her skin, burning steadily and without heat. She turned her hand over slowly, the way she turned clay pots to check their labels, taking in information, deciding what it meant. "I've read about this," she said. My voice, when I found it, was steadier than I expected. "Have you?" "In the older texts, the ones that agree with each other." She looked up at me. Her expression was not frightened and it was not overwhelmed. It was careful, the expression of someone who had just received a piece of information that changed the structure of everything and was giving it the respect of not deciding immediately what to do with it. "The mate mark. Both people feel at the same moment." "Yes." "You felt it." "Yes." She looked at the mark again. Then she said, and I have kept this sentence in my chest for every day since, "I thought that was supposed to hurt." "It doesn't." No, she flexed her hand gently, watching the mark move with her skin. It's warm. My wolf settled, the deepest settling I had ever felt from it, the kind that had no tension beneath it, no waiting. It had been waiting, I understood now, for a very long time. I should tell you something, I said. She looked at me with those storm-gray eyes, and I saw in them the same thing I had seen since the first night: honesty, patience, the willingness to receive information without flinching. She had carried harder things than a stranger's truth. She would carry this. "You're not a patrol rider," she said. "No." A pause. Then quietly, "How far from a patrol rider are you?" I told her everything. I did not soften it, did not arrive at it gradually, did not manage the delivery for effect. She had spent 6 years in a room where the ranked wolves above her decided what information she was worthy of, what table she was invited to, what consideration was owed her, and I was not going to be another man who decided how much of his truth she was allowed to have. I told her my name. I told her what Ravenmark was, what I ruled, what it meant. I told her I had ridden in deliberately without announcement, that Torin knew who I was, that the plain cloak was a choice, that the wounded shoulder was not, that had been genuine at least, the one honest disaster in an otherwise managed arrival. I told her I had intended to stay one night, and had not managed to leave. She listened. She sat on her stool with her hands in her lap and the mark still warm on her wrist, and she listened to all of it, and when I had finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Breck is going to be embarrassed," she said. I had not expected that to be the first thing. It made something loosen in my chest. He doesn't know yet. He'll have realized something is wrong. He's been watching the two of you since day 2. She looked at me steadily. "When are you going to tell him?" "Today, I was going to send Torin up." "You should go yourself." She said it without judgment, as advice. "He's not a bad wolf. He's just a man who performs better than he acts. He'll take it better if you go yourself." I looked at her, this woman who had been in a border hold for 6 years, excluded from the long table, given no family name worth citing, doing careful and precise work in a room that the ranked wolves above her rarely troubled to descend to, giving me measured counsel about the man who had done the excluding. Without rancor, without vindication. Simply, here is what will produce the best outcome. "You're not angry at him?" I said. "I've been here 6 years," she said. "If I were still angry, I'd have wasted 6 years on anger." She looked at the mark on her wrist. "Besides, things appear to be changing." "They are." She was quiet again for a moment. Then she said, "I want to be honest with you." "Please." "I don't know what this means yet." She held up her wrist slightly, the mark catching the light from the brazier. "I know what the texts say. I know the bond is real. But I've spent 6 years being managed by people who thought they knew what was best for me without asking. I would like to be asked." I had ruled for 12 years. I had made decisions that affected thousands of wolves. I had sat in a seat of power since I was 19 years old and learned, in that seat, that the decisions that lasted were the ones that carried the genuine weight of the people they touched, not just the authority of the man who made them. "Then I am asking," I said, "will you come to Ravenmark?" "As what?" "As my mate." I did not soften it into something smaller. "As the Alpha Queen of Ravenmark, if that's what the bond makes you, and it is if you choose it. Not as a court addition, not as a title for appearance. As my mate." She looked at me for a long time. I let her look. I had nowhere else to be. "I have a lot of fever root to finish checking," she said. "I'll help you. And after that you decide." She was quiet. She looked at the brazier. She looked at the mark. She looked at the neatly organized shelves, 6 years of careful work, of precise labeling, of doing the right thing in a room where the right thing went largely unacknowledged. Then she looked at me. "After that," she said, "I'll tell you." We finished the fever root. Then we checked the dried yarrow, which had also been in storage too long and needed sorting. Then she showed me the back shelf, the section of the room she had expanded herself, by taking a hammer and chisel to the existing stone and cutting 3 more feet of shelf space because she had needed the room. And I stood there looking at what 6 years of work had produced, and I thought, I came to this hold bleeding and expecting nothing, and I found the person my wolf has been quiet for. She told me yes that afternoon. She did not make a ceremony of it. She set down the clay pot she had been labeling, looked at me, and said, "Yes, I'll come to Ravenmark. But I want to bring my records." She gestured at the shelves, the notes, the journals, the years of observation about what grew at which elevation and what the older texts had gotten wrong. The new herb keeper will need them. Whatever you want to bring, I said. And I want a proper herb room. You'll have it. With windows. The lower rooms in Ravenmark, I've heard they're all below ground. Some of them, the south wing has windows. You'll have the south wing. She nodded, the nod of a woman who had made an agreement and intended to honor it. All right. I went up to find Torin, and then I went to find Breck. Breck took it the way she had predicted he would, badly at first. In a private way he was too controlled to let surface. And then with the particular rallying of a man who understood that the measure of him in this moment was going to outlast the embarrassment of it. He had been hosting the Alpha King of Ravenmark for 4 days without knowing it. He had very nearly turned us away at the gate. These were not facts that made him look well. He stood in his hall and absorbed all of it, my name, my rank, the meaning of Torin's presence. And then he said, with the decency of a man pulling himself together, "My lord, I apologize for the reception." The reception was adequate, I said, because it had been the Gate Wolf's hesitation notwithstanding. Drevorn is a sound hold. If I'd known. I preferred that you didn't. I let that settle. I have something to tell you about your herb keeper. He looked at me with the careful expression of a man who was beginning to understand that the ground had shifted considerably and was not yet certain how far. Sable, I said, carries the Ravenmark mate mark. She's my fated mate and will come north with me as Alpha Queen. I said it plainly, the way she had taught me, without softening it into something more manageable, without managing the delivery for anyone's comfort but the truth's. She has served this hold faithfully for 6 years. You have your hold's records. I would know whether her work has been recognized in them. Breck was quiet for a moment. Then, and this was the thing that made me think better of him than I had. No, he said. It hasn't been, not properly. Then you have time to correct that before she leaves. He did. He came to the herb room that evening. I was there, sitting on the second stool, watching her pack her journals, and he stood in the doorway with the stiffness of a man doing something his pride had told him was unnecessary and his conscience had overruled, and he said formally to her, "Sable, 6 years of service to this hold. I should have said this before. You have done the work that kept this garrison standing." He paused. "I'm sorry it's taken this long to say it." She looked at him the way she looked at everything, with honest assessment, not performing forgiveness, not performing indifference. "Thank you, Breck," she said, and then, because she was who she was, "Your Gate Wolf could use better triage training. I'll write out the protocol before I go." He blinked. Yes, thank you." "Second door, east steps, remind him." He nodded and left. From the doorway he glanced back once at her, not at me, with an expression that was hard to name precisely. Recognition, perhaps, the slightly too late arrival of it. The understanding that 6 years of her work had been in the lower rooms and he had let it stay there, and the pack had been poorer for it without knowing. I watched him go. "You gave him a way to make it useful," I said. "The Gate Wolf really does need better training." She rolled the last journal into its cloth case. "Might as well fix something on the way out." We rode north 2 days later. Torin organized the escort, quiet, no announcement, which was still my preference. The arrival at Ravenmark would speak for itself. Sable rode with her records in 2 canvas bags across the horse's flanks, and she looked at the moors in the early morning with the expression of someone who had looked at those particular moors for 6 years and was now looking at them for what might be the last time. Not grief, exactly. Something more complicated. The acknowledgement that a place had been real, that the work had been real, even in the years when it had not been seen. I did not fill the silence. She had given me that much, the habit of not filling silence, of letting the thing in the air be the thing in the air without rushing to cover it with words. After an hour, she said, "Tell me about the South Wing." So I told her about the South Wing. Ravenmark received her the way Ravenmark receives everything I bring to it, with full intention, which is to say, with the careful attention of a pack that has learned over 12 years that when I act with full intention there is no point in performing doubt. My counsel was not without reaction. I watched their faces in the great hall the morning after we arrived, when I stood with Sable at my right, and told them plainly what the mark meant and what would follow from it. There was surprise. There was, from 2 of the older members, a rapid internal accounting of what this meant for alliances they had been considering, matches they had been laying groundwork for. I could see the calculation, and I let them have it, because the calculation was going to arrive at the same place my wolf had already been for 6 days. There was no other option. The mark had spoken, and I had chosen. What I had not planned for, what I would not have predicted in 4 days of sitting in a border hold sorting fever root, was how completely Ravenmark's wolves took to her. Not immediately, not all at once, but steadily, in the way that things are true rather than the way things are performed. She came to the south wing herb room, and she made it hers, with windows and more shelf space than the previous occupant had required. And within 2 weeks every ranking wolf in Ravenmark had found a reason to descend those particular stairs. Not because I had told them to, I had, in fact, been careful to say nothing on the subject, because I wanted it to happen on its own terms or not at all, but because she was useful in the way that genuine things are useful, and genuine things are not difficult to find when you know what you're looking for. She sat at the long table now. She had been sitting there since the second night because I had placed her there, and she had sat without apology or excessive gratitude, simply as a person who belongs at a table taking her seat. The first time, 2 of the senior wolves had been slow to acknowledge her. The second time, 1. By the third, the long table had decided in its collective and unspoken way that this was how things were. She corrected me in council once in the 3rd week. I had been citing a protocol for the Southern patrols, a protocol that was, I was fairly certain, accurate, and she said from her seat, "That protocol is from 12 years ago. The Drevorn dispensary keeps more current records. The border has shifted since then." She looked at me steadily. "You'll want the updated version." The council went very still. I looked at her. She looked back with those storm-gray eyes, no challenge in them, no performance, just the plain accuracy of a woman who had spent 6 years watching the border from a low room in a southern hold, and knew what the current maps did not quite capture. "You're right," I said. "Bring the records." The council went less still, and then gradually became the kind of council that understood something had changed, not in procedure, but in weight. The weight in the room had redistributed. There was a new point from which it was balanced. She brought up the Briarwort again, 2 months after the arrival, in the herb room on a quiet morning when I had come down, because I came down most mornings now, because the room was still the place where the thing that had always been in my chest, the requiring, the weight-bearing, put itself down. "The older texts," she said, "the ones that disagreed. You said you hadn't had enough cases to confirm." "I have one now." She looked at the jar on the shelf, the Briarwort dried and pressed, her label in the small, precise hand. "It works for the 3rd thing, too, fever reduction, not just inflammation." She made a note. "I'll update the record." "For whom?" "For whoever comes after me," she said it simply, without drama. "The work is in the record. The record should be right." I looked at her, this woman who had corrected the Alpha King of Ravenmark in council, who had written out triage protocols for a gate wolf who had almost turned her away, who had spent 6 years in a room below a table she should have been sitting at, and had spent those years making the record correct so that whoever came after her would not have to start from scratch. "You've been doing this your whole life," I said, "leaving things better than you found them." She considered this, "I suppose. No one noticed. Some things don't need to be noticed to be worth doing." She looked at me with a slight arch that was as close as she usually got to Rye. "Some do, though." "I noticed." "I know," she went back to her note. "You sorted fever root. Most kings don't sort fever root. Most kings don't know what they're missing." She looked up at that, and the thing that crossed her face was not quite a smile. It was the neighboring thing again, the one I had been cataloging since the first night. Warmer now, settled. The expression of a person who has found the place they were walking toward and has stopped being surprised to be there. My wolf had been walking toward her for a long time. I understand that now in a way I could not have named in the years before Drevorn, when it had been simply quiet in me, not absent, just waiting, with the patience of something that knows it will arrive. I had ruled Ravenmark for 12 years, and I had been competent at it, and I had believed that competence was enough. That a king who made good decisions and held his borders and did not waste his people was a king who had done the work. And this was true, as far as it went. But there is a difference between a man who has done his work and a man who has come home, and I did not understand the difference until a woman in a wind-scoured border hold told me to sit on a stool and hold a cloth against a wound I had been pretending was not serious. She is at the long table now. She has been at the long table for 6 months, and the pack has stopped remembering a time when she was not. Because genuine things settle into place the way water settles into stone, not by force, simply by being what they are, in the place they belong long enough. The south wing room has windows. There is more shelf space than she has yet filled. She told me she plans ahead. The older texts are on the upper shelf, clearly marked as to which of their 3 claims she has confirmed and which are still under observation. The briarwort jar has a new label. In the mornings, I come downstairs. She does not turn when the door opens, because she does not need to. She knows the sound of my step on the east stairs, and she knows I will pull the second stool out from under the table and sit down without announcing myself, and she has come to expect it. This is not a small thing. In 12 years of ruling, I had not been the kind of man anyone expected in that particular way, the daily, quiet, take the second stool way. I had been relied upon. I had been needed. I had not been expected the way a fire is expected in a cold room, the way a particular sound on a stair is expected when the day begins. She expected me, and I found, to my considerable surprise, that I had been waiting my whole life to be that kind of expected. My wolf is still, not quiet in the way of waiting, still in the way of having arrived. There is a difference, and I know it now. I had ridden into a border hold bleeding, with a plain cloak and no announcement, looking for the practical thing. I had found her instead. She was more practical than anything I had been looking for. She gave me her last cloth and told me to hold still, and the mark found her wrist before I had finished bleeding, and I have not left.